Good morning, Govindai. I'm delighted to be back in Iceland. I was last year for the International Council on Archives conference in 2015. In my career, I have traveled to more than 50 countries, and people would ask me, what is your favorite country? And I would also always answer, the one I'm going to visit next. But then I came to Iceland. And it is such a shockingly beautiful country with such wonderful people. This is my second trip, and I hope it is not my last trip. Let me thank my archival colleague and friend and conference buddy, Njordr Sigurdsson, for inviting me to speak to you and for facilitating such a wonderful event. I'm also delighted to share the stage with Alsted and Rosa, and I'm so interested to hear your perspective on my remarks. Njordr has shared some of your work with me, which I have read as far as my Icelandic language skills allow, which I confess is limited to saying hello, takk fyrir. I am overwhelmed and humbled that we are all sitting here speaking the language that one person speaks as her native tongue, when you could all be speaking in Icelandic. I am sorry, I cannot reciprocate, but I will do my homework. I am happy to speak today about some of the topics I addressed in my 2019 book, A Matter of Facts, The Value of Evidence in an Information Age. I wrote this book for a general audience to raise awareness of the changing nature of data, records, and archives in a digital age, and to encourage the public to play a central role in preserving and protecting sources of evidence. As I will explain, I use the term evidence, especially when I am speaking to the public, because I think that term helps us negotiate our way through some problematic stereotypes, that data are dynamic and digital, that records are bureaucratic, and that archives are dusty and old. The title of my talk comes from an Icelandic saying I encountered in my research: a story is only half told if there is only one side presented. One of the core values of evidence, of archives, records, and data with evidential value, is that they help expose us to more than one perspective. Without the ability to see different sides of a story, we cannot find the truth, a truth based in facts and proof, not opinion and conjecture. Truth is not a luxury. It is an essential quality of a civilized society. Without evidence-based truth, we open ourselves to lies, deceit, corruption, and chaos. As George Orwell wrote in his famous book, 1984, and when memory failed and written records were falsified, when that happened, the claim of the party to have improved the conditions of human life had got to be accepted, because there did not exist, and never again could exist, any standard against which it could be tested. Writing in 1948, Orwell was reflecting on the dangers of totalitarianism in Stalinist Russia and the crisis of a dictatorship. Today, we are living through another despotic regime, a Putinist Russia. The increase in authoritarianism around the world, mis- and disinformation, lies, deceit, and abuse of power, these are the consequences not just of wicked intent, but also of failed memory and falsified records. The lack of concern for evidence threatens to diminish the standards against which to measure the conditions of life. Access to authentic, reliable evidence is a grave challenge in a post-truth world. Records and archives professionals cannot resolve this challenge ourselves. We need to work with others to raise awareness of documentary evidence as the standard against which to test the claims of those in power. I wrote my book to help with such awareness raising. So in my talk today, I outline why I believe facts and evidence matter, and I look deeply at the differences between truth, data, facts, and evidence. I then explain why I think the public's assumptions about data, records, and archives are so problematic. I offer recommendations for change, and at the end, I welcome your ideas about how we might move forward together. So let me begin. There are many types of truth. There is scientific truth, factual truth, and personal truth. We can say, for example, that it is true that water is wet, if we accept the scientific definition of wet as covered or saturated with liquid. But is it true that water has healing properties? That is more of a spiritual truth, personally important, but difficult to substantiate. If you believe water has healing properties, great. I don't know if water has medicinal qualities, but it soothes my soul. I love water. The idea of being in Iceland with all this water makes me want to sing. I was singing in 2015 when we took this picture. That love is my personal truth. My husband holds a different truth. He is not very fond of water, and he hates the rain, which is a problem since we live in a rainforest. My interest today, though, is not in personal truth, but in factual truth, in evidence-based truth. You can love or hate water. It doesn't matter. But if you want to argue that water is not wet, science will prove you wrong. So let me take you through the steps that lead to demonstrable evidence-based truth. Imagine you hear water falling. You see drops of liquid outside the window. That sound and the sight of the drops, those are data. They're pieces of raw content. They are devoid of meaning. The water falling is an act, and the sight and sound of it are facts. But is it rain? That's a supposition. Perhaps somebody is dumping a bucket of water from upstairs. Perhaps the water is coming from one of your spectacular Icelandic waterfalls. To confirm that the water is rain, we have to test our hypothesis. We have to confirm that the water is falling from a cloud in the sky, not from a bucket or a waterfall. So we step outside. We see the water is falling. We feel the wet on our skin. We don't see a balcony. We don't see a waterfall. We can confirm that this is rain. So the raw data, the sight and sound of water, becomes information, rain, because we have placed the data in context. We know what rain is, and this is rain. We confirm it because we've applied our scientific definition of rain. What if we want to know how much rain is falling? We do this by capturing and measuring the rainwater. Well, now we need a standard to validate the measurement. Inches or milliliters, ounces or grams. There we have a problem. Standards are cultural and political. If societies don't agree on their tools and standards, we fail before we start. One of the challenges with the digital world is that we are all racing ahead with technology so quickly, our existing standards cannot keep up. Societal norms are breaking down in the process. But go back to our water. We choose milliliters as our standard. We set out a beaker to capture the rain. When we check our beaker later, we find 5 milliliters fell in an hour. Our raw data, the water, has now become not just information, but a new kind of data, statistical data, which can be used for computational analysis. To remember the numbers, we document them. We write them down on a sheet of paper, or we input the information into a computer. By doing so, we create a record. To give that record added meaning, we contextualize it. We write a title on the paper. We give the computer file a name. We capture the metadata. That helps us interpret the record so we can find it later. We then put the record away so we can get back to it later, tomorrow, 20 years from now. Our data has turned into evidence, and that evidence gives us truth. We can prove that it did rain that much on that day. But what if we want to know if it rained 20 years ago or 100 years ago? We can't fabricate that data after the fact. Meteorology wasn't a common profession a century ago. And this is where archives demonstrate their beauty. Before meteorologists were tracking rainfall, farmers were mapping their fields, tracking harvest, and measuring weather conditions. Ships' captains were filling logbooks with measurements of the sightings of seals and whales, of the wind and the rain. Explorers were documenting weather as they journeyed across the mountains. But those farmers and ship's captains and explorers, they didn't measure the weather to suit us. They measured it to suit them. The documents shown here were created by farmers to comply with Iceland's 1915 law on measurements of fields and vegetable gardens. These records were not made to keep historians happy 108 years later. But those sources are used today by historians, scientists, and others to track harvest cycles, analyze weather conditions, and understand environmental change over time. This research supports historical study, but it also supports land use planning, environmental management, and public policy. Archives allow us to discern the truth long after the acts and facts are erased from memory. But for archives to hold that power, they must be authentic, and they must remain authentic over time. As my English friend and archival colleague Jeffrey Yeo argues in his excellent book, Records, Information, and Data, records are, or ought to be, persistent representations. For something to serve as a record, he says, it must remain stable in form and content. Only then can it serve as proof today and a century from now. In a digital age, the question is, how can we capture and preserve digital data as evidence, as a persistent representation? One of the amazing qualities of digital data is mutability, the ability to be used and changed in endless ways. But how can you have flexibility and stability at the same time? To illustrate the challenge of protecting documentary evidence, I want to go through the data to evidence chain again. In 1918, a mysterious influenza began to circle the globe. People suffered fever, nausea, aches and pains. They might develop pneumonia. Some died within hours of the start of symptoms. From 1918 to 1920, the world was ravaged by this virus, which gained the unfortunate and inaccurate name Spanish flu. Some 500 million people were infected. At least 20 to 50 million people died. Some think the death toll was 100 million. The 1918 pandemic gives us a valuable, if tragic, example of the process of data to information, records to archives, and evidence to truth. So imagine someone develops a fever and a cough. Those are the acts and the facts. The patient is admitted to hospital. The nurse takes his temperature, 39 degrees Celsius. The fact of the temperature becomes a point of raw data, number 39, and then turns into information, 39 degrees Celsius, because we have a standard for measuring the temperature. When the nurse writes down the temperature, it becomes a record. It goes into a file with other records, hospital admission records, medical charts, prescriptions, discharge notices, death certificates. These become the evidence of the patient's experience and the evidence of the 1918 flu. The evidence gives us the truth. The 1918 flu pandemic was real. Long after the records were created, some of them found their way into archival institutions. The National Archives in the United States, the archives of the International Red Cross in Switzerland, the Wellcome Collection in the United Kingdom, they all hold extensive collections of archives of the 1918 pandemic. In my country, in Canada, Library and Archives Canada holds over 600,000 military personnel files from World War I. Now, the flu was raging as the war was coming to an end, and many soldiers fell ill with the virus. The medical notes in those personnel files in Canada provide a wealth of documentary proof. Because the records are safe and stable, because they are persistent representations, they are available to historians, epidemiologists, and scientists today. The records are available in part because archivists did what we do so well. We acquired, we preserved, and we made available those records so they could serve as authentic sources of proof, as persistent representations for use a century after the events in question. But before we blush with praise, let us acknowledge three realities about physical analog archives, such as those of the 1918 pandemic. First, the ability to extract and share data from within physical analog records is and was problematic. The paper is fragile, the handwriting is scratchy, and the standards for capturing medical data are often inconsistent or absent. Does the word influenza equate with the word flu? Can we confirm that influenza means the virus raging in 1918, or was it another type of infection? What if influenza is recorded as a condition, but the cause of death is noted as heart attack? What was the actual cause of death? Second, record making and record keeping are not neutral. The 1918 to 1920 pandemic began as World War I was ending. Censorship was widespread. Governments did not want to record influenza as a cause of death. They feared it would lower morale for the soldiers and raise fear in the public. In fact, the very name Spanish flu has political, not factual origins. Spain was neutral during the war, so newspapers were not so heavily subject to censorship. When King Alfonso of Spain fell ill with the flu in 1918, news of his condition circulated immediately and widely. So the flu in Spain became the flu from Spain, and the name Spanish flu was born. So the third challenge with using archival records is that physical files are complex and fragile. Once they come into archival custody, just preserving them becomes a challenge, never mind reproducing them. A military personnel file from a century ago is filled with forms and cards and letters and notes, all different shapes and sizes. The pages are deteriorating from the iron gall ink. The handwriting is often indecipherable. At Library and Archives Canada, it took more than 40 staff members 4 years working full-time to digitize over 622,000 military personnel files, 2 pages shown here. Some of those files hold 100 separate pieces of paper. Library and Archives Canada estimated that it would have taken a single person working full-time over 163 years to do that job. So when someone says to me, "Why don't you just digitize it all?" I struggle to keep a straight face. I don't believe archivists ever will, or could, or should digitize everything physical in our repositories. I think we have more important problems to deal with, as I argue in my book, and I will talk about next. So let's take this chain of events again, this time with the COVID-19 pandemic. As of May this year, over 765 million people have contracted the virus. Close to 7 million people have died. It is a tragedy, as the 1918 pandemic was a tragedy. But let's look at the course of events in terms of data to evidence. Someone develops symptoms, cough, fever, aches. That's the act and the fact. At the hospital, a nurse measures the temperature and heart rate. The temperature is information. The number 39 becomes 39 Celsius. But now the doctors aren't necessarily documenting on paper. They may use databases, emails, digital images. So in a digital world, we can go from act to fact to raw data, maybe to a record, then to statistical data, then maybe back to a record, then maybe back to statistical data again. The progression is not linear. It's kind of circular and very strange. Computers make it very easy to manipulate and share that data. But how can we ensure the data serve as persistent representations and at the same time allow us to do our work easily? Now, we do have better medical and statistical standards today than we had 100 years ago, but they certainly aren't perfect. Interpreting cross-institutional or international data from the COVID-19 pandemic is difficult, if not impossible. Some governments generate hospitalization statistics every 2 weeks, but they only release the numbers of deceased every month. One hospital might record death from COVID-19, but another might cite death with COVID-19. Those small words have huge implications. This problem is only increasing now with the growth in large language models for machine learning. Think of the recent turmoil over artificial intelligence and ChatGPT. If computers can create and manipulate and fabricate data or words or faces or voices, where is the proof? Where is the truth? So that's the issue to me, isn't it? In a digital age, we treat data as data, not as evidence. Government officials, politicians, business people, and the public, they all just assume that the data sources exist and that they will always exist as persistent representations. But they don't see the link between the data they create today and the evidence they want tomorrow. Writing about the COVID-19 pandemic in the Atlantic Monthly magazine in March 2021, American journalists Robinson Meyer and Alexis Madrigal argued that the American response to the pandemic was failing from the start. The reason, they wrote, was that government officials assumed that the data needed to make evidence-based decisions just existed, and that this data would always be accurate, reliable, and available. To quote Meyer and Madrigal, data are the federal government's reality. As a gap opened between the data that leaders imagine should exist and the data that actually did exist, it swallowed the country's pandemic planning and response. The COVID-19 pandemic began after my book was published in 2019. Meyer and Madrigal's analysis matched my own thoughts, though. I believe people do care about records and archives. The problem is they assume that the evidence they need, for whatever reason, will just exist, now and for as long as they need it. They believe that someone, an archivist, a computer expert, someone, is busy capturing documentary sources, that the materials are stored away, digitized, indexed, and made available instantly, comprehensively, accurately. No additional funding is needed because computers are magic and archivists are keepers. So we receive digital files with no metadata, or USB keys holding corrupted documents, or paper records that are mislabeled and misfiled. Perhaps the most tangible example I can offer right now relates to the ongoing conflict in the United States between the Department of Justice, the National Archives and Records Administration, and former U.S. President Donald Trump. The former president took official records into personal custody in blatant violation of U.S. law. The effort to retrieve those records has been heroic, but the fact that such mismanagement of official evidence could happen in the first place, that is a result not just of malicious intent, but of weak laws, limited oversight, and a misperception that those records will just exist and be safe. An archivist cannot keep a record that is destroyed. We cannot rescue a data file that is corrupted. We can't wade through 10,000 digital photographs to find the 20 images that provide evidence. You and I know the problem with digital data and records. We spend our days trying to solve it, and we come to archival conferences to complain about it. But the public, the funders of archival work, the decision makers in government, I don't think they know. Not really. Most people hear archives or archivist, and they think old, static, and stable. I wear pink for a purpose. There was some public outrage at the news that Donald Trump had taken official records home in violation of the law. But the legal ramifications are still to be determined. I certainly hope he doesn't get away with breaking the law, but I fear the penalty will be minor, and I fear there will not be change as a result. People assume that archivists are just working away in the basement, doing the job they assume we are going to do. But the job we have to do to help protect the digital record cannot happen if we are not there to help ensure records are well made from the beginning. We cannot wait for someone to finish their work or their life and then ask them, please would you pack up your documents and send them to us, and we will root through them looking for material with enduring value. That is the archival equivalent of an archaeological dig. As a records and archives consultant, I try to start every project by saying, let's not just manage what you have. Let's figure out what evidence you need in the first place, and then how to make it well and how to keep it well. Sadly, I am often shut down from the beginning. The client might say, your job is archives, not records, and certainly not data. We brought you in to help us manage the 500 boxes of paper records in the basement. What I want to say in reply is a fat lot of good it'll do you to have a clean basement and a chaotic shared drive. But I bite my tongue, which is perhaps one of the reasons I wrote my book. I consider it therapy. To help the public understand their role in managing evidence, I have been urging my archival colleagues, and I urge you, to seek out partners and allies, to build teams of experts to help us change direction. I am seeking a cohesive approach where archivists are part of a larger data evidence ecosystem. The value add, the contribution that archivists bring, is to help our communities decide what to keep and why. We provide the long view of the value of evidence. Our allies include computer programmers who figure out how to build systems that support authenticity, and legislators who pass laws to support the protection of evidence, and members of the public who understand why evidence matters and lobby for adequate funding and support. If organizations don't manage their raw data, they cannot protect the small portion that has evidential value. And when they don't protect the evidence, they can't guarantee the authenticity or usefulness of the resulting statistical data. It is a vicious cycle. So how do we change direction? I have been recommending 4 actions. First, modernize legislation and regulations to strengthen digital data and evidence management. Second, to integrate evidence management in the construction of computer technologies, adopting an evidence by design model. Third, to engage with the public, with stakeholders, allies, and partners, to raise awareness and understanding of the importance of archives. And fourth, to strengthen our own archival ethics, so we have a strong professional framework for digital records and archives management. Let me expand on each of these ideas. The digital world is, to use an American phrase, the Wild West. There is little to no regulation governing how societies use information technology. The evidence laws and regulations that exist are often incoherent or inconsistent. For example, the Australian government issued a temporary ban on Facebook in 2021. This gesture was more symbolic than substantive. The European Commission, European Council, and several American states have banned TikTok on work devices. If you're listening in, all you down at Harpa, listen to me. Pay attention. Talk about this in your meetings. They banned TikTok, but they perceived security risks with the app. But that's not the real concern. It's the underlying concern of foreign espionage and interference from the owners of the technology. Surely there is a more effective way to mitigate that threat than banning one app. I want to see legislation that is effective, logical, pragmatic. I want to see governments address the question of evidence clearly and fully. How do we cope with legislation that defines data one way in one law, records differently in another law, and evidence not at all? For all its strengths, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, does not include sufficient recognition of the enduring value of evidence. Like so many laws, the focus is on data, when the real issue is how is that data being used as evidence. Legislative change must be coordinated, inclusive, and ethically sound. What are the ethics of regulating social media, for example? Facebook can be used as a platform for the dissemination of fake news, but so can television. Why ban one medium and not another? I believe society will see positive change when we address data, information, and evidence laws systematically, prioritizing accountability, transparency, justice, and integrity. Let me cite the words of Sebastian van der Laars, Chief Executive Officer of the Trusted Web Foundation. He has argued for strengthening data and information legislation, saying that consumers should demand transparency and accountability. If information impacts your life, as a citizen, you deserve the freedom to verify how that information changed over time and who the sender is. As van der Laars argues, integrity must be a precondition, not an afterthought. Imagine also how much more effective and accountable computer technologies would be if authenticity and integrity were built into the system. Great strides are being made to develop tools that capture and preserve authentic digital signatures, that use blockchain technologies to improve security, that automatically code software to capture critical metadata from the start. As Andy Parsons, Senior Director of the Content Authenticity Initiative at the computer company Adobe, has explained, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, or C2PA, is developing technical standards for certifying the source and history of media content. So rather than the hit and miss capture of metadata by humans, say taking a photograph, which requires that the creator or holder of information adds that contextual information after the image is taken, Adobe is developing tools that sit within the hardware and software. Coding is being added to digital cameras so that GPS tracking and descriptive data are captured the moment an image is created. The software then exports this metadata along with the image so that it cannot be changed, but that it can be shared to protect the evidence. Ethics are essential here too. Is it right with technology to use algorithms for facial recognition when those algorithms might be biased towards one type of face? Is it acceptable to allow private companies to add tracking devices to cell phones or refrigerators or sound speakers? Can a government harvest personal digital data without permission? For instance, there are over 7 million closed-circuit TV cameras in the United Kingdom. That's more than one camera for every 11 people. The average person walking around the United Kingdom is likely to be captured on CCTV up to 70 times a day. What happens to those images? They are evidence. Who decides it is okay to capture the images in the first place? Who decides how long to keep them? Who decides whether and how to share them? How do we prevent the manipulation of such evidence? Look at what artificial intelligence can do today, such as adding and removing people from images. We cannot uninvent these tools once they are out there. I think it's important to think hard about what they're going to do and how and why before we start. Archivists are too often excluded from those important conversations. The public leaves us out because they think we are responsible for the old stuff, not the new stuff. So we need to dispel that image. I want to build society's evidence literacy, an enlightened attitude towards evidence, like information literacy or media literacy. If people start to see the evidence behind the data, I think they will help our cause. They are already demanding governments address bias, security, and privacy. We just need them to take the next step, to see the implications for evidence. I want us to work with partners and allies, including historians, journalists, lawyers, and genealogists, but also filmmakers and writers and human rights advocates, and the average citizen. Perhaps the most strategic partnership we can build today is not maybe, as you might think, with historians, but with journalists. Historical study is essential, but historians suffer the same misunderstanding we do. People think their work is academic, scholarly, old. Rosa, we know that's not true, but we have to fight that misperception together. But journalists immerse themselves in today's evidence to highlight today's news. And I think they are suffering today, and working with them might help them. It might help us. In the United States this month, BuzzFeed News has shut down, and Vice Media is close to bankruptcy. I am not overly familiar with those tools, but I know they have been used and I know they are disappearing. What happens if a local newspaper shuts down? What happens if the town's reporter loses her job? No one is at the city clerk's desk filing an access to information request. The government might say, well, there isn't any reason to keep our archives. No one is there. So you might say newspapers are old and social media is the information source now. Sure, people are finding their news on Facebook and TikTok and Twitter, which is dying its own sad death. But they are also living in digital silos, perhaps only seeing mis or disinformation. I believe that when journalism suffers, when newspapers die, when social media cannot be trusted, civic engagement shrinks. When people don't care about their society, they don't care about the evidence. The archivist is not recognized. The historian is not recognized. Eventually, the evidence is not recognized, and it is lost. And we can't recreate the truth if the proof is gone. So I urge us to build partnerships in the data evidence ecosystem, to work together to defend data, evidence, and information. Together is so much better than alone. Now, I have mentioned the word ethics several times already. I believe deeply in the importance of an ethical approach, whatever the work may be. The International Council on Archives Code of Ethics, passed in 1996, states that the primary duty of archivists is to maintain the integrity of the records in our custody and care. But how can an archivist maintain the integrity of records in our custody or care if we aren't involved in ensuring that integrity from the start? Traditional codes of ethics do not speak of the archivist as records manager or information policy analyst. Does the role of the archivist need to be redefined? Maybe. In my work as a consultant, I rarely touch a historical photograph. I spend my time advising governments and organizations on how to manage electronic records. But my mission is broader. My mission is archival. I want to help society preserve evidence. To do this, I insert myself in the record-making, and archive keeping process to provide support for both the new and the old. Now, I am often challenged at this point on my argument for ethics. People say, how can you impose ethical standards when the work of archivists is not neutral, but political? I don't believe the archivist was ever neutral. Like everyone, no matter their work, we bring our perspectives to the office. That does not bother me very much. I am more bothered about the fact that if we don't change direction, we won't have any evidence to care for in the first place. So as we talk about the dangers of bias, let's remember where archivists fit in the chain of events underpinning truth and justice. Journalists, historians, lawyers, and judges, they all draw on evidence to do their jobs, to report the facts, to analyze historical events, to represent the law, to dispense justice. They depend on records and archives to do their work. But journalists, historians, lawyers, and judges are biased too. So they create and uphold ethical codes to hold them to account. If they fail, and some do, then they might write fake news stories or poorly sourced history books. They might use lies to defend a client or issue judgments based on preference, not precedent. So where do people turn then when the news or the history or the law does not tell the truth? They turn to the evidence. They look for the proof of the acts and the facts, not just the raw data or the statistical data. So who captures and preserves the proof? We do. The archivists do. We are the last defense against lies and deceit. In Orwell's words, we protect the evidentiary standard against which the conditions of human life can be tested. I absolutely accept we are all biased. Even more reason, then, that we should be guided by strong ethical frameworks. My book calls for a new approach to the management of evidence as part of an integrated, collaborative data evidence ecosystem. We cannot wait in a digital world for archival materials to come into physical custody before managing them. We need to be smart and strategic to work collaboratively to protect evidence now, not just for posterity, but for justice and equity and accountability today. Let me end with another comparison with the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the realities of the pandemic in Canada was that it highlighted severe cracks in our healthcare system. Doctors, nurses, technicians were doing all they could to keep people alive and return them to health. But poor living conditions in assisted living environments or homeless shelters, for example, exposed vulnerable people to the virus. Medical professionals struggled to save patients once they were sick, but they couldn't fix the conditions that helped make them sick in the first place. The public conversation in Canada now is about how to build a more caring medical system, one that supports healthcare workers better so they can deal with the sick or injured effectively. I want to look at that challenge differently. What if we were a caring and a smart society? Rather than focusing on improving care for the sick, what if we took steps to reduce the risk that people got sick in the first place? Preventive medicine does work. Preventive evidence management works too. Rather than focus on how to manage archives in custody, I want to focus on how to help societies make good evidence from the beginning. Archivists help to preserve evidence so society has all sides of the story, not just a half-told tale. The resources we care for are vital. They are as vital as water. And some have suggested that data and evidence are the new oil. I disagree. I think data and evidence are the new water. And I love water. But I believe people have a right to clean, fresh water. And they have a right to authentic and reliable data and evidence. I am working hard for that future. And I hope you will join me. Thank you. Tack för er.